In December of 1966, the world was distracted. Vietnam was consuming the nation's sons. The Beatles had just stopped touring. A young country attorney named Ronald Reagan had just been elected governor of California. People had things to think about. On the Tiburon Peninsula, a finger of land that juts into the northern reaches of San Francisco Bay, ringed by water and money and the particular silence that settles on wealthy coastal communities before the rest of the world wakes up. A hunter was walking through the scrub along Paradise Drive. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was doing what hunters do, paying attention to the ground. What he found stopped him. A woman, lying in the brush near the edge of the cliff. Red auburn hair, a red cotton dress, a white trench coat, its collar turned up as if someone had left in a hurry. A Westclock's wristwatch still on her wrist, its face frozen. She was badly decomposed. She had no identification, no purse, no name. No one, anywhere, was looking for her. The Marin County Sheriff's Office was notified. Investigators arrived. They documented everything, the clothing, the jewelry, her estimated age, somewhere between 45 and 60, her height, roughly 5 feet 2 inches, her weight in life, perhaps 105 pounds. They did not know her name. They would not know her name for 58 years. Her body was eventually taken to Mount Tamalpais Cemetery and Mortuary in San Rafael, about 12 miles from where she was found. She was buried there, without ceremony, without family, under a designation that is perhaps the loneliest phrase in the English language, Jane Doe. In the United States, approximately 4,400 unidentified bodies are recovered each year. They are entered into a federal database called the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, Namus. Approximately 1,000 of those bodies remain unidentified after 12 months. They sit in folders, in cold storage, in databases, in the memories of the detectives who worked the cases, many of whom have long since retired or died. They have case numbers, they have file numbers, they have case designations that begin with the letters UP for unidentified person. Jane Doe had a case number too. She was Namus UP 12018. For 58 years, she was just a number. Then she wasn't. On March 19, 2025, the Marin County Sheriff's Office announced that Namus UP 12018 had been identified. Her name was Dorothy Jean Williams. She was born on August 24, 1917. She was from Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. She crossed an ocean. She built a life. She got lost. And for 58 years, nobody knew where she was. To understand what happened to Dorothy Jean Williams, you have to understand who she was and why someone like her could disappear without a trace in the middle of a world that had been getting steadily better at keeping track of people. Dorothy Jean Williams was born on August 24, 1917, in Hobart, the capital city of the island state of Tasmania, sitting at the bottom of Australia. In 1917, Tasmania was a quiet, remote British territory, sheep and orchards, and the cold Southern Ocean. The Williams family, by the standards of the time and place, was unremarkable. Working class, English-speaking, Australian-born. We do not know much about Dorothy's childhood. We know the shape of her life as it was recorded, which is to say, incompletely. What we do know is that by 1943, Dorothy Jean Williams had met a man named François Vaillancourt. She was 26 years old. He was, based on the name, almost certainly of French-Canadian heritage. Not unusual in an Allied world in wartime, when men of many nationalities moved through ports and cities in ways that would have been impossible a generation earlier. In 1943, they married. In 1944, they came to San Francisco. San Francisco, in 1944, was the most important city in the American West. It was the staging ground for the Pacific War. The port was full of ships. The streets were full of uniforms. The city was also full of immigrants, refugees, servicemen, and their families. People who had come from everywhere and settled in a place that seemed, in the post-war sunshine, like the beginning of something. Dorothy and François Vaillancourt settled into that city. They had children. They built what looked from the outside like an ordinary life. We do not know when the life began to unravel. We do not know exactly what happened between the young woman from Tasmania who arrived in San Francisco in 1944 and the woman in the white trench coat who was found on a cliff road in Tiburon 22 years later. We may never know. When you look at a case like Dorothy's, a woman in her late 40s, alone, in distress, no identification, what does that tell you about her life in the weeks or months before she died? There is one detail in the record that haunts everyone who has looked at this case. 3 months before her body was found, in September 1966, a woman matching Dorothy's exact description appeared at a fire station on the Tiburon Peninsula. She was stranded. She had no money. She needed a place to sleep. The firefighters, whoever they were, their names are not recorded in the case file, turned her away. She walked off into the dark. That was the last known sighting of Dorothy Jean Williams while she was alive. Fire stations in the 1960s. They were supposed to be a place of refuge, weren't they? What would have happened if someone had made a different decision that night? We don't know if Dorothy was murdered. We may never know. Her cause of death was listed as undetermined. The body was too decomposed, the physical evidence too degraded for investigators to say with certainty what happened to her. What we know is this: she was alive in September. She was dead by December. She was alone. She was somewhere she didn't belong. And when she reached out for help, the help wasn't there. The Marin County Sheriff's Office did what they could. They documented, they photographed, they cataloged the clothing, the red dress, the white trench coat, the Westclock's watch. They noted the physical details that might one day identify her. They entered the case into the records of the county, and then, slowly, inevitably, the case went cold. To understand why a case like Dorothy's goes cold and stays cold for nearly 6 decades, you need to understand what investigators were working with in 1966, and more importantly, what they weren't working with. In 1966, forensic science was, by any modern standard, primitive. There was no national DNA database. There was no national missing persons database. There were fingerprint records, but only if you happened to have been fingerprinted, and only if someone happened to think to check them. There were dental records, but only if the victim had a dentist, and only if someone submitted those records for comparison. There were photographs and sketches and notices pinned to bulletin boards. There were calls made to neighboring counties, to California's Department of Justice, to local newspapers that might print a description and a sketch. And there was the fundamental, irreducible problem at the heart of every unidentified person case. In order to match a body to a name, you need a name to try. When you say a case goes cold, what does that actually mean mechanically? What are the steps that lead from active investigation to a file sitting in a cabinet? In Dorothy's case, the specific mechanics of how the case moved from active investigation to cold storage are not fully documented. What is documented is the outcome. By the time Namus was established in the early 2000s as a national clearinghouse for unidentified remains, her case was among the many thousands of Jane and John Does entered into the system. She was case number UP12018. The entry contains what we know: the approximate date of discovery, the location, the physical description, the clothing. A forensic artist had created a facial reconstruction at some point, a careful, considered rendering of what she might have looked like in life, based on her skull and bone structure. It is a kind face, a face that looks, even in reconstruction, like someone who had been kind. Marin County is not a place we associate with cold cases. It is a place we associate with hot tubs and hiking trails and the kind of wealth that comes when technology money settles next to natural beauty. But Marin County's history is older and stranger and darker than its current reputation suggests, and the Marin County Sheriff's Office, like every law enforcement agency in the country, has a cold case unit that bears the weight of the unsolved. Over the decades, the case was reviewed. Periodically, a new investigator would pull the file, go through the details, submit the information to state databases. Periodically, the case would be profiled in cold case newsletters, in forensic science databases, in the occasional local news story that ran a sketch and asked, "Does anyone know this woman?" Nobody answered, and the decades passed. The Marin County Jane Doe case represents something that is both heartbreaking and, paradoxically, hopeful. It is a case that was never forgotten. The investigators who worked it over the years never stopped trying. The case file was never lost. The evidence was preserved with a care that would prove, eventually, to be absolutely critical. Because in 2022, the Marin County Sheriff's Office made a decision. They picked up the phone. They called a laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, and everything changed. The Woodlands, Texas, is a planned community about 30 miles north of Houston. It looks from a distance like a lot of other Sunbelt suburbs, a mix of retail and residential that has expanded steadily since its founding in the 1970s. From the outside, the building at 8 Switchbud Place looks like any other office park tenant. The signage is modest. The parking lot is not remarkable. Inside, however, is something that would have looked like science fiction to the investigators who first cataloged Dorothy Jean Williams's remains in 1966. Othram, Inc. Othram was founded in 2018 by a husband and wife team. David Mittelman, a computational biologist, and Kristen Mittelman, who serves as the company's chief development officer. Their specific mission, stated openly, proudly on their website, is to use advanced DNA technology to solve crimes and identify the unidentified. They are the world's first laboratory built specifically to apply modern parallel genome sequencing to forensic evidence. That distinction, built specifically, matters more than it might seem. Most forensic DNA laboratories are equipped to perform specific standard tests, the kind of analysis that runs a sample against CODIS, the Federal Combined DNA Index System, looking for direct matches in a database of known offenders. That system has solved an enormous number of crimes. It has also hit a wall. The wall is simple. CODIS can only tell you if someone's DNA is already in CODIS. If the person who committed a crime, or the person who died and was never identified, has never been processed into that system, the database returns nothing. Othram was built to solve a different problem. What Othram does begins with a technique called forensic-grade genome sequencing, a proprietary process that Othram has registered as a trademark. The name is precise. This is not standard DNA testing. This is the sequencing of a comprehensive genomic profile from samples that would defeat conventional forensic testing entirely. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what investigators are often dealing with when they pull evidence from a decades-old case. A bone fragment from a body buried in acidic soil for 40 years. A tooth recovered from a site that has been flooded. A hair recovered from a piece of clothing that has been in an evidence bag since 1966. In a building that has been through California earthquakes and changes in humidity and temperature. The DNA in these samples is almost certainly degraded. It has been attacked by bacteria, by moisture, by time. Under a standard forensic protocol, the kind used for CODIS testing, these samples would be returned with the notation: insufficient DNA for analysis. Case closed. File stays cold. Othram's laboratory protocols were designed specifically to work with samples in exactly this condition. Using massively parallel sequencing technology, the same kind of technology that drove the explosion in consumer genomics, applied to forensic samples, Othram's scientists can extract usable genetic information from fragments that no other lab would even attempt. But sequencing the DNA from a sample is only the first step. Once Othram has produced a comprehensive genomic profile, a SNP profile, meaning a map of hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, the places in the genome where individuals differ from one another. The next challenge is figuring out what to do with that profile. This is where forensic genetic genealogy enters the story. Consumer DNA testing has become, in the past 2 decades, a phenomenon. Companies like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and others have collected DNA samples from millions of Americans and built databases of genetic profiles. Most of these people uploaded their DNA for entirely benign reasons. They wanted to find relatives they didn't know about, understand their ethnic heritage, discover whether they might be at risk for certain diseases. They wanted to know where they came from. What they didn't necessarily anticipate, although most of the major platforms disclose this possibility in their terms of service, is that their DNA could become a tool for law enforcement. The technique is called forensic genetic genealogy, or investigative genetic genealogy. The principle is elegant in its simplicity. If you have an unidentified person's DNA profile and you upload it to a database where millions of people have shared their DNA, some of those database profiles will be genetic relatives of the unidentified person. Maybe a third cousin, maybe a second cousin once removed, maybe someone more closely related. You don't need a direct match, you need a starting point. The work of forensic genetic genealogy is, at its core, the work of a genealogist, building family trees, cross-referencing records, following threads through census documents and vital records, and obituaries and newspaper archives. The difference is the starting point. Instead of starting with a known person and working outward, you start with a DNA profile and work inward toward a name. When a match is found, the genealogist builds a family tree, branching from the most recent common ancestor between the unknown person and the database match. Then they work forward through time. Who were the children of that ancestor? Who were their children? Who among all the descendants fits the profile of the unknown person in terms of age, sex, geography, and circumstances? It is painstaking work. It can take weeks or months. It requires both the precision of a scientist and the patience of a detective. And when it works, when all the threads converge on a single name, a single face, a single life, it is, by every account of those who have experienced it, extraordinary. In 2022, the Marin County Sheriff's Office submitted forensic evidence from the Dorothy Jean Williams case to Othram's laboratory. The funding for the advanced testing came from the Roads to Justice program, a nonprofit initiative that supports technology-driven cold case work, helping to bridge the gap between cases that have evidence and labs that can process it when local law enforcement budgets cannot. Othram's scientists went to work. The evidence was old. The DNA was degraded. Under any previous protocol, this would have been the end of the story. But these were not previous protocols. Months passed. The laboratory worked. Then, in early 2025, Othram's forensic genealogy team had what every researcher in this field hopes for, but cannot guarantee: a hit. A genetic match in a database, somewhere in the extended family tree of the woman who had been lying unidentified in a Marin County grave since 1966. The genealogical research began. Family trees were built, records were searched. The team moved carefully through the evidence, following each thread to its logical conclusion, eliminating branches that didn't fit, narrowing the field. And eventually they had a name. Dorothy Jean Williams, also known as Dorothy Jean Vaillancourt, born August 24, 1917. Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. On March 19, 2025, the California Department of Justice confirmed the findings. Othram, working with the Marin County Sheriff's Office, announced publicly that the Marin County Jane Doe had been identified. It was, they noted, the 56th publicly announced case in California solved using Othram's technology. 56 cases. 56 people, each of whom had been waiting, some for decades, for someone to say their name. When you hear that a family has received news after this many years, what does that mean to you personally? What does it feel like to be part of that moment? The identification of Dorothy Jean Williams is, among other things, a story about distance. Distance in time, 58 years between death and identity. Distance in space, the Pacific Ocean, more than 7,000 miles of water between Hobart, Tasmania, and the cliffs of Marin County. Distance in information, the gap between a family that lost track of a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a case file sitting in a sheriff's office with no way to connect them. We know some things about how Dorothy ended up in San Francisco and very little about how she ended up alone on a cliff road in Tiburon. She came to California with her husband, Francois Vaillancourt. They had children together. There are family members, at least one of whom made public statements following the identification. What happened to the marriage? What happened to the family structure that should have provided a safety net when Dorothy needed one? These are questions that cannot be answered here because they are private and because the available records do not tell us enough. What we can say is this. By September 1966, Dorothy was alone. She had no money. She needed a place to sleep. And the last person to see her alive turned her away. How often do you see cases where someone has immigrated, lost touch with their family of origin, and ends up dying without anyone filing a missing persons report? What does that pattern tell us? The family's response to the identification, filtered through public statements and social media posts, is what you would expect from a family that has been carrying a wound for 6 decades without knowing it was a wound. At least one family member posted publicly after the identification. The words, without quoting them directly, expressed a combination of grief and relief that is unique to this particular kind of news. The discovery that someone you loved, or might have loved, or should have been given the chance to love, died alone, far from anyone who knew her name decades ago. It is the kind of news that closes something. It does not heal the wound. It gives the wound a name. Dorothy Jean Williams was buried at Mount Tamalpais Cemetery and Mortuary in San Rafael. The grave has been there since 1966. For 58 years, the grave was unmarked. Not by her name because no one knew her name. That has changed now. A woman from Tasmania, a red dress, a West Clocks watch that stopped at some unknown hour, and now, at last, a name on a stone. Dorothy Jean Williams, August 24, 1917, December 1966, approximately. She was someone's daughter. She was someone's mother. She was not nobody. She never was. Dorothy's story is one story, but it exists within a landscape of thousands of others. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, Namus, was established by the Department of Justice in 2007, though its roots go back to earlier efforts to create a national clearinghouse for information about the missing and unidentified. Before Namus, there was no systematic national database of unidentified remains. Information was siloed in county medical examiners' offices, in state databases that didn't talk to each other, in paper files, in basement filing cabinets. The problem, it turns out, was immense. Currently, Namus contains records on more than 14,000 unidentified persons. These are bodies that have been found and documented. A face without a name, or bones without a history, or an entry in a system that is waiting for someone to come along and make a connection. The numbers behind that figure are sobering. Each year, approximately 4,400 unidentified bodies are recovered in the United States. Of those, roughly 1,000 remain unidentified after a year. The rest are identified through a variety of methods: fingerprints, dental records, missing persons reports that connect with the right database at the right time, family members who recognize a description. But that means that every year, approximately 1,000 new unidentified persons join the backlog, and the backlog grows. When you look at the scale of the problem, thousands of unidentified persons, thousands of missing persons who haven't been connected to them, where does that leave us as a society? The cases in Namus represent an extraordinary range of circumstances. Some are like Dorothy, people who died decades ago before the infrastructure existed to identify them and whose cases simply accumulated dust. Some are recent, people who died in circumstances where their identities were immediately obscured by violence or accident or the particular cruelty of dying alone. Some are victims of serial killers, people who were taken and killed and discarded, whose families were left to wonder what happened to them. Some are homeless, transient, or otherwise living in circumstances that made them difficult to trace even when they were alive. Some are immigrants, like Dorothy, people whose family connections crossed borders and oceans, whose disappearances didn't register in the databases of the country where they died. All of them were someone. One thing that strikes people when they first encounter this field is that these aren't just statistics. Each case file represents a specific human life. How do you hold on to that when you're working through dozens of cases? Against this landscape, the work being done by labs like Othram, nonprofits like the DNA Doe Project, and programs like Ramapo College's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center represents something genuinely new, a systematic, technology-driven assault on the backlog. As of December 2023, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to resolve a total of 651 criminal cases, identify 464 unidentified decedents, and provide investigative leads in cases across more than 40 states. Those numbers are growing every month. Dorothy Jean Williams is one of those 464. She is not a statistic. She is a woman from Tasmania with auburn hair and a West Clocks watch, and a family that crossed an ocean. She is a woman who walked away from a fire station into the dark and did not come back. She is a woman who waited 58 years for someone to say her name, and now they have. What does it mean when a name is returned after 58 years? It means, on the most immediate level, that a grave has a name on it, that a family, however scattered, however broken by time and distance and grief, has an answer where before there was only absence. It means, on a broader level, that the system worked, albeit 58 years late. And it means, on the broadest level of all, that this is possible. That cases this old, with evidence this degraded, in circumstances this seemingly hopeless, they can be solved. The tools exist, the science exists, the human expertise exists. What has often been missing is the funding and the institutional commitment to apply these tools systematically to the backlog. Now that we know this is possible, that a case 58 years old can be solved with forensic genealogy, what is the obligation of the system going forward? What changes need to happen? In the chapters that follow in this series, we will look at the broader landscape of forensic genetic genealogy, where it came from, how it works, the cases that defined it, the science that drives it, and the ethical and legal questions it raises. But we wanted to begin here with Dorothy, because Dorothy is what all of this is really about. Not the technology, not the databases, not the SNP profiles and the genealogical research and the massively parallel sequencing. A woman from Tasmania with auburn hair and a West Clocks watch who walked off a cliff road in Marin County in 1966 and waited 58 years for someone to come looking. They came. She was found. She had a name. She always had a name.